From Sicily, Mr. Justin Forsyth, who is UNICEF Deputy Executive Director. He's attending the G7 taking place in Sicily, and as you've probably seen yesterday, the press release issued by UNICEF. UNICEF is at the G7 to urge leaders to adopt a 6-point action agenda to keep refugee and migrant children safe. So without further ado, I will turn the floor to Mr. Forsyth, and he will speak to you for a few minutes, and then we can take some questions and answers. Mr. Forsyth, do you hear us?
I can, and good morning. Thank you very
Mr.
much.
Forsyth, do you hear us?
It's good to speak to you from Sicily, and good morning everyone in Geneva. As we've just heard, the G7 leaders who are coming into Taormina today in Sicily and will be meeting over the next few days are only a stone throw away from unfolding crisis happening in the Mediterranean. Thousands and thousands of people, as I think we'll hear from our colleague from the IOM in a few minutes, have been rescued in recent days and in the last week. And very tragically, over 30 men, women and children, including some very small children, have drowned in the last few days. As you know, the central Mediterranean route is one of the deadliest, most riskiest journeys in the world for migrant and refugee children. Over 1,000 children have drowned since the beginning of 2016. As our statement said yesterday, over 200 this year alone. And this unfolding crisis, as leaders are meeting, is a wake-up call to the G7 to really step up to the mark to take action on this very challenging issue. I talked yesterday to Dr. Bartolo, who's very well known here in Italy. He's a doctor on Lampedusa, the island in the Mediterranean. He's with a few other doctors and nurses and health workers, a first-line responder as refugee and migrants are offloaded often from Italian Coast Guard ships on Lampedusa. And a lot have been offloaded in the last few days because Catania here in Sicily has been closed, and a lot of the refugees and migrants have been taken to Lampedusa. He said on 3 boats were rescued, and 200 people were disembarked on the night before last. And he described the situation to me of these refugee and migrants. They'd been at sea for 3 nights. They were so exhausted because they not only hadn't eaten or had water on the boats, but in the holding detention centers of the smugglers and traffickers before they were embarked on the boats, they hadn't eaten for a few days, and many couldn't walk. They had to evacuate a number of them by helicopter to hospital. He also talked of a number of very small children, but also some teenagers, and one young Eritrean girl, he said, was so traumatized. She'd been raped before embarking, and on her journey, we know Libya is particularly challenging for young women. He also said there was a young boy who had visible signs of torture. And we know that route across the Mediterranean is extremely dangerous for children, but it's often the horrors that they've experienced on their journey to the Mediterranean, in Libya, through the desert in Niger, or from Eritrea through Sudan, that they speak most in horror about. Many of the children have faced abuse, rape, even slavery. One of the girls that I met described how she was kept underground in a detention center in prison for 8 months and raped repeatedly. In the report we produced a few weeks ago, there's a young Nigerian woman called Mary, and she said she'd been repeatedly raped. She gave me a quote which is worth repeating. She said that man who was a trafficker, she called him Ben, is not his real name, took 2 of us girls one night. He gave the other girl to another man, and he said to me if I didn't sleep with him, he would not bring me to Europe. He raped me. I wanted to get away, but I couldn't. I had no money, no phone. I didn't even know where I was to escape to. And this story that we've heard again and again, and I heard yesterday from unaccompanied children UNICEF works with here in Sicily, is repeated again and again to us of this abuse and rape and torture and modern-day slavery that's happening in Libya. So that's why we are urging all the G7 leaders to agree this 6-point plan to help protect unaccompanied children in general who are on the move. And we hope that even if the leaders can't agree on the wider migrant and refugee crisis, and there are obviously big divisions between them, that they could agree something practical to help children who are most vulnerable in this situation. And we've been talking to all the different governments in the run-up to this meeting, and we hope that we can make some progress, but we know it will only be a stepping stone to further discussions in the United Nations and other fora. On that, I'll stop because I know you only want me to speak for a few minutes, and then I'll leave it open to any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Forsyth, for sharing this with us. Very horrendous stories, and I hope that leaders will heed your call. We'll turn it over to the room. Are there any journalists who would like to ask some questions of Mr. Forsyth? Yes, Lisa Schlein from Voice of America.
If you could briefly summarize what this 6-point plan is that you have, and I mean, you say that you hope this will be a wake-up call to the G7 to stand up and take action. It's been so many years that they've had an opportunity to take action, and not very much has been done. Do you, I know you have to be optimistic, but do you truly have optimism about this, and how can you buttonhole them and make them listen, change the situation?
So just on your question on the 6-point plan, I won't do all the details, but and we can send you it. But it basically includes very specific recommendations about not detaining children, but finding practical alternatives, about how we keep families together, about providing education, but also about protecting children when they're on the move, and then about making sure that we don't do anything that creates xenophobia in terms of discrimination against children, often in places, for example, here in Europe, in Italy or Greece. So we've got it's got some specific recommendations there. In terms of being optimistic or not, well, you know, a number of European governments, the Germans, the Swedes, here in Italy, they've actually done a lot for unaccompanied children. You know, Sicily is full of unaccompanied children. In children's centres, I visited one yesterday. Extraordinary, generous local people helping. I was on the beach in Palermo yesterday as well with thousands of Palermo children, you know, showing their support for migrant children. The mayor of Palermo said, there aren't any migrants or refugees. Once you've landed in Palermo, you're Palermian, if that's the right term. And so that it's interesting that there's also an enormous amount of support for this issue, particularly to help children, generosity of people here in Sicily. But you're right, more widely, Europe, the G7 more widely, hasn't taken the necessary action to protect children. Now, I'm not under any illusion that this meeting in the coming days is going to change that dramatically. But we hope, because it is in Sicily, which is the epicenter of one of the most dangerous routes in the world, where many children have drowned and many families have lost their lives, but also they've been through these extraordinary abusive journeys, that it will focus minds, and it could be an opportunity to try and get leaders to focus on this issue and then to follow up afterwards and agree some practical measures. I mean, here in Europe, we're hoping the European Union is also going to do more. In Italy, they've passed a bill recently, which is a model which we're trying to get replicated by the European Union.
Thank you, Mr. Forsyth. We have then Nick Cumming-Bruce from the New York Times.
Good morning. You said you've interacted with all the G7 governments. Could you just say a little bit about your interaction with the US government and whether you have had any assurances about any particular initiatives they will do to support this plan?
So yes, we have met with the U.S. government and we've talked about this issue. I mean, as I mentioned before, even though I think there's wider disagreement on migrants and refugees, the one issue that I think there is agreement on, which includes the U.S., is around trafficking and around children. And in a way, our hope is that even if leaders can't agree on those wider issues, and there is obviously a big difference between Chancellor Merkel's position and others in the G7 on this issue, including the US, that they could agree practical measures in terms of taking on some of this worst form of trafficking and smuggling, and also how you might help very vulnerable children that are being abused by traffickers and smugglers, and also providing help. Now, we have no guarantees from any of the G7 governments, apart from the Italians, who have been very committed from the very beginning. But in our conversations with all of them, they've all been interested in our proposals specifically about children, and then specifically with the US about trafficking and smuggling.
Well, just to follow up, I mean, when you're talking about taking on trafficking, what are you suggesting?
So I think there's obviously a security response needed to the trafficking in terms of the flow of money, in terms of catching these criminals. But there's also a more practical response on the ground in Libya where, for example, we in the IOM and UNHCR are working, which is what practical support we can provide to these children, how we get them out of these detention centres, how we make sure that there's health and other provisions provided to them. We work with a lot of local groups in Libya alongside some of our UN colleagues. And I think as well as I'm meeting the foreign minister of Italy in a few minutes, we're talking about practical measures that can be provided on the ground that help individual children, as well as obviously the things which are beyond our mandate, which are to do with more how we stop the flow of money and the criminal business that's going on around trafficking, which, as you know, and I know you've all covered, is very, very big business worth several billion in Europe alone, dollars.
All right, thank you. Yes, we have a question from, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, Esther Saoub, German public television ARD. The European Union is negotiating migration pacts with the trafficking countries and with Libya in particular. I was wondering how you see these pacts, especially concerning the children's situation in the region.
Well, we think what the Italian bill that's just recently been passed is a model, and that in that bill makes an explicit commitment not to send children back to places which are dangerous. And I think that has to be at the heart of the European policy on this issue, that we don't send children back or force them back into Libya, because we know that one of the most dangerous places in the world to be a child is in Libya. I mean, you know, it's not just the terrible abuse, it's rape, it's even slavery. I met two Eritrean boys who told me how they escaped initially into Sudan and then being sold into slavery in the Sinai Desert, but then had just got out and then come to Libya and then been treated as slaves in Libya by militias. So we have to be very, very careful about sending children back to these very dangerous places. And I think that has to be a really central place. I think the European Union needs to have a very comprehensive approach on this, which covers both dealing with the root causes, how you protect people and children in particular in transit, the rescue, and then how we make sure across Europe there's a shared burden in terms of looking after these unaccompanied children. In Italy, they're taking a huge part of the load. I mean, Sicily's children's centres are overwhelmed with unaccompanied children.
All right, thank you. Are there any final questions for Mr. Forsyth? No more questions. So, Mr. Forsyth, thank you very much